Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure for me to be here today. The talk that I'm presenting to you is in 4 parts. And if we run out of time, I will have to rush the last part or omit it altogether. But let's hope the going will be good. Basically, I will give something of a quick overview of Chinese architects in the last 30 years, mainly because in the English language, a simple, useful account is not available. And then in the second part, I'm talking specifically about gardens in Suzhou, especially about how to restore the visual experience of these gardens in a way that is useful for designers. And in the last 2 parts of the presentation, I'm speaking about small boutique hotels in 2 rural locations in China. One in southwest China, in Yunnan province, a place called Dali, where tourism has been doubling every 3 to 4 years. And also outside Shanghai in Moganshan, which is the only mountain area outside Shanghai accessible by car within 2 hours. So that's generally the outlook of the talk today. I'm giving you on the screen some account of what the people who are currently practicing and aged 35 or thereabouts, people born in the 1980s, received from their seniors in the profession. The seniors, I mean people born in 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. Chinese education for architects since the 1980s, after the Cultural Revolution, was very much a local variant of the Beaux-Arts tradition that was imported by the University of Pennsylvania in the earlier part of the 20th century. They were interested in formal composition, basically. And around the year 2000, when internet came to China, a lot of these older architects started challenging received ideas that they had grown up with. They led the way also in engaging opportunities of marketization. Basically, since 1993, there has been a more or less real estate market, and people had a lot of opportunities. Private practice as architects was also something that they had developed from around mid-1990s onwards. Beforehand, everyone worked for state enterprises, and the advent of the private practice meant that people could develop all sorts of niche markets for different clients. So by the time the people born in the 1980s entered university, these things had already been happening around them, and the teachers of the universities were very much involved in that. Then in the people immediately before 1980s, those born in the 70s, and who are now in the full flight of their careers, in around 18 years ago, they were very interested in something called experimental architecture. There was no definition for that. It basically meant something like experimental art, that is, something that could be considered away from the usual norms of the architectural profession at the time. The people born in the 1970s, 18 years ago, were interested in ideas of modernism. You can imagine Beaux-Arts modernism were a bit of a chalk and cheese, and Bauhaus tradition didn't really settle in China very well until the last 20 years, I would say. Although there were pockets of practice in Guangzhou specifically that had very notable examples of modern architecture, this wasn't widespread, nor was it the mainstream. People born in the 1970s had a lot of opportunity to practice. They were usually already engaged in design projects while they were still students. And so they were capable of an early maturity that probably wouldn't be seen in Australia or in Europe, where opportunities to practice wouldn't go to young people so quickly. For the people that I'm interested in today, those born in 1980s, they grew up with a discussion of tectonics. This was basically a reaction against poor quality construction. They weren't able to do German or Swiss quality construction, but people were talking about it as an aspiration. The students born 1980s were in school maybe 13 years ago, and at the time people were discussing architectural space, spatial syntax, something like that. This generation of students was the first generation to grow up with the internet. The internet came to China around 1919-2000, around the time of the Sydney Olympics. This allowed them to gain access to a huge range of imagery that would otherwise not been available to them in printed media. And for a while, the students outran the teachers and the publications sanctioned by the state. They also had joint studios with foreign schools of architecture. In the last 18 years, more and more schools of architecture from overseas had joint studios with places like Beijing and Shanghai. This internationalization outran a lot of schools in Australia. Opportunities to study overseas became more generally available to people in this group born 1980s. Their family circumstances were better than those before them, and there was more cash to support them to go overseas. So this was similar to what happened in Hong Kong maybe during the 1970s. So let me summarize very quickly for you what were the major design lessons presented by senior members of the Chinese profession. By this I mean senior members who were not working for the state enterprises called design institutes. Liu Jiankun from southwestern China in the province of Sichuan is very well known nowadays for discussing recycled materials. You remember some while ago there was a massive earthquake in southwestern China, so there were a lot of debris. And he developed interesting approaches to recycled materials in response to that. For Liu Jiankun, he was somebody who, at least in the early days, subordinated structural considerations to formal issues. He would design the layout and the massing, and the structure would just be matched to it, column and slab, basically. He was interested in light entering the center of a room, and in the early work he was paying a lot of attention to Louis Kahn. This was mainly because light shining in a particular angle on a wall that is not well finished highlighted the blemishes. He was interested in more recent work in low-key, large-scale, really large-scale urban places, and Sichuan was recently exhibited in the Venice Biennale. He was somebody who did work, who didn't pay attention to whether they would look good in photographic spectacles. Sometimes he would do details that when you photograph them wouldn't come off as things that were highly detailed. He was not interested in doing work that competed with KPF in terms of the precision of detailing. He thought that was too technical. And there was a sense of detail in his work that didn't depend on geometric precision. Because he worked with a lot of unskilled laborers on sites, he did one-to-one mock-ups on site to control the quality and to look forward to what could be done with the skills available. And he was doing this 20 years ago, and for the people born in the 1980s, they remember a lot what he did 15 years ago. Sometimes when we have conversations, the young ones will remember more of Liu Jiakun's own stories than he himself could recall now. He had one or two projects with political leverage. Some elements of political protest, rather understated, is embodied in the work. So he presented a spectrum of architectural work and extended a menu of options to designers, very unusual for his time. Yongho Chang is very well known for developing the idea of private practice as a practitioner. He didn't work for state enterprises. He was very close to foreign institutions and used them as part of a globalized circuit of fame to legitimize his own proposals in China. He developed a private practice university media nexus that was very, very effective and showed other Chinese architects what they could do to establish a brand for their own work. Zhang Ke in Beijing recently won the TOTO Prize, as you know, and has started teaching studio at Harvard. He was one of the earliest people to graduate from Harvard in the 1990s. He is very well known for not imagining that the geometric lines he draws in a drawing would be actually constructed. He was always anticipating that mistakes would emerge at every step. And his construction process would use the second step to cover the mistakes of the first step, and to use the third step to cover the mistakes of the second step. And in this way, even though construction quality might be lower and errors are emerging all the time, the end product looked much better than one might expect in the first place. He was interested in defending strategic aspects of design for the same reason. He knew that he couldn't get everything right, so he knew which 6 things he needs to get right and defend and insist upon on site. Broadening the palette of architectural effects was also something that he was interested in. He was interested in large spans, 32 meters, working with rather limited engineering colleagues in China. This was something that 10 years ago one didn't see very often. In the more recent work in Beijing with the Hutong renovations, he worked with NGOs, and this is still something relatively not so common in mainland China in architectural practice. The last architect that I want to mention as a precursor to the generation that I'm interested in is Atelier Das Haus in Shanghai. You might have heard of the Long Museum in Shanghai, which developed a one-to-one relationship of form and force. This was a lesson developed in Switzerland with reinforced concrete almost 100 years ago, but somehow never arrived in China with a lot of architects. And Liu Jiankun and his partner, Chen Yifeng, blazed a trail and showed everyone what could be done when we finally understood the one-to-one relationship of form and force. Also, they developed a view of how modularity in design can accommodate site-specific issues. In the more recent work with a tea house, working at a much smaller scale, they explored scalar ambiguity and ideas of atmosphere. So this is the expanded menu available to those born in the 1980s and are now just completing their first projects. And in a moment, I'm going to talk about some of that work. The second part of this presentation deals about losing control of graphic media. By this, I mean that in the last 100 years, the Chinese architects have basically abandoned traditional media associated with depicting the environment. By this, I mean painting, woodblock printing, that kind of traditional media. Instead, they all used orthogonal drawings and linear perspectives, like everyone else. And most people would have thought that modernizing the media in this way was okay. But in what follows, I want to show that by modernizing the media, they also lost something. And we are now, in the last few years, in the process of re-examining this. I'm going to talk to you about a garden in Suzhou, which is about 500 years old. And at first, I thought that I have found evidence of spatial compression in the visual field when we analyze it. And in the end, I decided that I discovered something similar to the experience of Chinese painting, where spatial depth is not stable. When we go to gardens nowadays, we don't usually see the kind of spatiality we see in paintings. And in the next 5 minutes, I hope to share with you how that could be experienced, again, even with those gardens we have nowadays. I want to say that the photographs I use are indexical images, that is, they are not conclusive evidence, but they, like the index of a book, they point to specific pages in a book, and shouldn't be confused with those pages. This is the Zhuozhengyuan, popularly known as the Garden of the Humble Administrator. We walk into the main part of the garden from the east, and we see a pavilion around 10 o'clock in the direction, and we go there. This is a framed view looking into the eastern part of the garden, where for 150 years it was ruined as a vegetable patch, pretty much nothing to see. When we look at it and we take photographs in different climatic conditions, we notice that the scene is presented as a layered scene. The ground surface has been hidden, and we see layers where the distance between the layers are ambiguous. When there is mist, the spatial depth changes, and the desaturation of color, the elimination of the background creates a different impression of the spatial depth. Nearby, there's a pavilion with 4 moon gates, and 2 camera positions allow a tabletop and a bridge on the left-hand side to hide all the water. And when we move forward with the camera, the water is revealed again, and you can see how the spatial depth is very different. So generally, when the ground surface is hidden or the water surface is hidden, spatial depth changes. Usually it compresses. In the mist, it looks like this. Again, the mist eliminates the background, and the color desaturates and implies a different kind of depth. This is a large garden where the central pond has a east-west sight line of 120 meters. On the left-hand side, there's a bridge. The bridge is about 80 meters away from the camera, and behind the bridge, you will see an embankment. The bridge is overlapping with that embankment, and in fact, these two elements are 40 meters separated. So you can see that there is a spatial compression with 40 meters at the edge of the visual field. And behind that, there is a boundary wall separating the middle part of the garden from the western part of the garden, and behind that, more trees. So you see layers compressed at the periphery of the visual field. You see a moon gate at the far distance there, 120 meters away. When we go to the moon gate and take a photograph in this direction, this is the view we would get. So the bridge now is 40 meters away from us, and it is 80 meters away from the embankment behind it. So from this view, 80 meters is being compressed and made much less evident. So in the plan published, this is the part that we're looking at. This is where we were, the bridge and the moon gate. So we began to read for the contradictions between the photographs and the plan. So you can imagine how in the universe of linear perspective, where there's a stable scale, the photographs is now basically apparently contradicting the stable scale implied by the orthogonal drawings. This is the main hall looking north. There's a pond and there's a pavilion to the north. And when we stand on the pavilion and sit down at the table there and look south, this is what we see. The distance has been compressed a great deal. The objective distance is about 30 meters, but you can see that it is not stable. So this kind of experience basically asks us to use short-term memory to remember what we saw 5-10 minutes ago when we were at the other vantage point. In this photograph, we see a foreigner on top of a rockery, and the foreigner looks surprisingly small. So we made an experiment with a student. We asked a student to walk into the rockery, and everyone would take photographs of her. A few minutes later, she would be there. So in plan, the depth variation is no more than 4 meters or so, and so there's no reason why suddenly the body should shrink so much. But this is what we come to expect from the Chinese paintings, where human body would not be scaled in a consistent way in landscape. We just didn't expect to see it in a garden, but there we are. The eaves line actually could be used as a reference point, but its height is ambiguous. The height of the rock, the height of the trees, the human body height, especially half hidden, are all ambiguous in terms of their referencing each other. And so this might be one of the reasons why we are seeing this kind of uneven shrinkage of the size. So what we have so far is understandable in terms of yin and yang, which is devolved as an interplay between the full and the empty, the far and the near. I won't take the time to go through the entire text in case we run out of time later on. But if you wish, you may take a copy of the screen image here. It's basically saying that yin is not a classification term. It's not that rockeries are yang and water is yin, but rather all the yin things are becoming yang. All the far away things are becoming near, vice versa. So when you move around, you will experience this yin becoming yang and yang becoming yin. Far and near are intermixed in the experience. So the body position is not innocent. The body position, as you move around, is activating the transformation of the yin and the yang. So if we switch to a German discussion about appearance, it's not that the garden has elements and these things have appearances, the appearance of a garden. You have a wall opening or a zigzag bridge. In the terms of Martin Seal, appearances reveal themselves on them. So they are either moving further away from you or shrinking in size and so on. The next garden I talk about is a much smaller garden. There's no 120 meters to talk about, and so it's much more similar to the context of the boutique hotels, which are all playing with the issue of the large and the small. This is the plan of the garden. As you can see in the north-south direction, it's a longer dimension. And instead of allowing the pond to take the full width of the site, the division of the site actually goes north-south and makes two cuts. One cut here, one cut here. And so the pond, in terms of the width of the pond, is much smaller than otherwise we could have. So the whole issue then becomes how to make it not appear so small. And this is an issue that designers of boutique hotels, especially if you have 24 square meters for a room and you want to charge $200 a night in a rural Chinese location, this would be an issue. So the topic is size and how big is big. And since we were talking about the bigger garden in terms of depth, we are throwing that in as well. We find a similar framed view that we previously saw. The hidden ground surface brings all the framed elements much closer to the frame. On the southeastern side of the garden, there is a passageway leading to the pond. And as you walk closer to it, the pond seems to increase in depth. So you are getting closer to the pavilion on the opposite side, but as you move closer, it seems to be moving further away. North of the pond, there is a room, and there are two doorways. The smaller doorway leads to the bigger space. The bigger doorway on the left leads to the smaller courtyard. In other words, the sizing of the wall opening confuses you in terms of your expectations. On the right-hand side, as you move towards the wall opening, for about 3 meters, there would be no reason for you to revise your estimation of how large that space beyond would be until you reach the opening and you realize that it's much bigger than you thought. When we look from the north side of the pond towards the south side, a flower bed is strategically positioned to hide all the water of the pond. And as you expect from the previous discussion of the larger garden, whenever a ground surface or a water surface is hidden, there is a spatial collapse of distance. And so we experience the pavilion on the opposite side of the pond much closer to us than otherwise would be. If we go to the opposite side of the pond and take a photograph to the north, this is what we see. From the south, we necessarily see the surface of the water, the flower bed is there, so the distance is now more apparent than previously. There are other aspects where if we shoot a camera at the corner of a room, we notice that the size and the heights of openings don't match up. And this avoids a very strict scaled reading of the space. When we have views like that where the lines don't seem to connect, the coherence of the space outside also seems to be chopped up so that we begin to see something like a collage effect momentarily. In fact, in actual experience, you'll be walking through this within 2 seconds, but for a moment, the lines don't match up and you don't read this as a coherent synoptic field. There are also things like this where the frames point in different directions and seem to be different from what we expect in linear perspective. For a small place, there would be a lot of opportunities to sit inside because there's not much outside for you to go to. So we pay attention to these instances where a solid panel is hiding access to a view of the ground and the lattice pattern is pixelating whatever is outside and introducing an ambiguity of spatial depth. Elsewhere in the garden, in north side of the pond, the height of the windowsill don't match up and also avoids a single scale reading of the interior. The modules of the lattice work also different, helps this as well. In order to not go into a small place and see it all at the same time, we would have to hide certain things so that in every view you see, you don't just see things laid out in front of you, but also you experience things hidden from you. So this is from the southeastern side of the garden going towards a courtyard from the architectural sequence. Different from the other sequence walking towards the pond, this one blocks you frontally right away. And the rockery is blocking you, and as you go outside, the bamboo is also blocking you, and you are not allowed any sense of how large the courtyard is outside. So there's more blocking. And now on the left-hand side, you do see the extent of the depth of the courtyard. Behind the building, there's another court with a lit space. And this also makes it quite ambiguous how much further you could go. When we go to this building and we turn back 180 degrees and look south again, this is the view. The rockery is blocking you again. And you will notice that the footprint of the rockeries and the other elements in the courtyard is fairly irregular. And this helps us make ambiguous the sizing of the whole area. When we return to the pond, we also notice how the plants have been hiding everything. Emerging from the corridor, looking south, this plant is hiding everything to the south. And there is to the north a two-story building, which is now fairly much hidden behind the plants and the single-story walkway. This tree is doing a lot of work hiding things. Pine tree is doing a lot of work there. So it's best if the architecture doesn't do the job alone. The plants have to be working together. Usually, if you have 4 or 5 tricks played out in the same visual field, people are less likely to pick it out. And usually that's what we attempt to look for. There are other instances where a bridge like this is miniaturized to under 2 meters in length, so that this exaggerates the diagonal distance of the pond. For a smaller area for the garden, there would not be 120 meters of sightline. But we do find sightlines that pierce through indoor, outdoor, semi-outdoor, indoor, outdoor spaces. So that it would be like one of these grilled pieces of meat we can have with peanut sauce that we sometimes see in the restaurant here. So if we go to the south and we look north again, this is the view, and because the water has been hidden, the pavilion has been pulled much closer. So what we want to conclude from all of this is that there is an aspect of spatial imagination in China that is still can be experienced today that is not about linear perspective and cannot be drawn up simply by SketchUp. There are also pattern on pattern, which seems to tell you that there is an outside beyond the outside, which is very helpful if you don't want just inside and outside. But there's an outside of the outside that you can't experience, but somehow you know is there. And that helps you assure yourself that you're not in a terribly small place. So there is a discussion here which you can photograph if you wish and make a note for yourself. It is about metalepsis, which is in Hitchcock movies, the idea of a story within a story. So you thought he was going to murder her at one stage, and then when the camera pans back, you realize that there wasn't a really story, and there was another story going on. And this kind of story within story is in the shift of the diegetic frames that we encounter in gardens as well. So I made a summary of all the keywords I have been using so far, and I'm highlighting in green all those things that I think we are going to find relevant to the boutique hotels later on. I don't mean to imply that young designers in China are somehow working with Chinese gardens in a great way. I mean to say that in a culture with some kind of historical depth, different areas of endeavor may have occasionally some resonance that shouldn't surprise us. So the third part, this is the hotel in Dali. Dali is not a famous city. It's in southwest China, not rich. In 1984 or 85, nobody knew about it as a tourist destination. That year, Lonely Planet published it and said it was an authentic part of China. Suddenly, 10,000 foreigners descended with foreign currencies, and they were totally unprepared. After a while, the mainland Chinese themselves were rich enough to do internal tourism. They decided to go to Dali to look at foreigners because there were not so many foreigners in their own cities. The foreigners were not happy about that. So eventually, the local tourism became more directed towards, well, internal tourism. And so nowadays, with the pollution in the bigger cities, people are very happy to leave Beijing and Shanghai and take their family for a week to Dali. You could rent a room for 300 yuan a night, and in this hotel that we want to do, the average floor area is 24 square meters per room, and we want to charge $200 and not make you feel bad. At the street level, in the old city, there's a cafe from the hotel overlooking the street, and the related level of the cafe is about 1 meter off the related level of the street. As a result, walking by, you won't be able to see the floor surface of the cafe. And as you know from the Chinese gardens just now, whenever the floor surface is hidden, a space collapses. And so you can see this a little bit already in this view, because the floor surface there is hidden, and the distance of the wall of the room at the back of the courtyard is a bit ambiguous with everything else. There is actually a sill height here at the back of the cafe, and that assures that the ground surface of the courtyard behind would be hidden. And you can imagine how the space collapses when the lighting level is different at dusk, when there is light inside the cafe already, but light is no longer in the courtyard, and so on. So we could have a situation where a change in grade and the sill height triggers something about the height of the depth of the space. This is about a 10, 13 meter span all the way from left to right. So there is an upturned beam that you don't see. And the idea is that you use the floor surface and the ceiling surface as flat surfaces, not to distract you with any beams, and then to have this very light thing opening up the whole thing to you. It's actually a two-story building, and so to have a span like that takes some doing, and is not what you normally see in Dali. At the scale of the rooms, though, 24 square meters is not large, and allows you, say, 13, 14 rooms on a rather limited plot, and they insist on sloped roofs in this part of the town for conservation issues. So you'll see that in a minute. The entry is on the right-hand side, and it's not a grand entry. It's off-axis twice, and is leading you in. And this is the view of the courtyard looking towards the street, and where we mentioned just now there's a window sill height here. So looking this way, because you're looking down on the street surface, you necessarily see the street surface, and so the distances are manipulated and different from what you had from the first view. So we're entering the courtyard in the middle, and there is a certain compression of height, and then you are in the courtyard. The courtyard is rather long, and is divided into three parts, simply because you have a tea room with glass on three sides in the middle part. So this is the main courtyard north of the cafe just now, and the tea room is on the left-hand side. In the notes, I'm saying the setback relationship of the walls created different aspects in the common courtyard area. And the scalar ambiguity is implied by the position and sizing of windows and doorways, and also by hiding the position of doors from certain vantage points. You know there's upstairs, but in this view, you don't know how quite to get there. In other words, there's a disjunction between visual and tactile fields. In Chinese gardens, we often see pavilions in the distance where we don't see a path leading up to it, and this is exactly what is happening here. You notice as well the thinness of the eaves overhang here. This is not a traditional way to do a roof with tiles. They have simply omitted one of those elements to make it thinner. It looks traditional, but actually it's not a traditional construction. The next view I'm offering you is about the suppression of the wall thickness. This is a way to avoid a scaled sense of the space, because wall thicknesses can be telling you a story about that. The window frames also have to be detailed to work with that. So whenever you want an effect, you probably are doing 3 or 4 things at the same time. You notice that there's no brickwork here. It's off-form concrete with a strange thin strips of wood for the formwork, and so there's a scaling trick being used as well. So for every effect, 3 or 4 aspects of detailing are called upon to sustain it. We talk about it this way because we don't prefer to talk about things as single cause effect relationships. I did this because of this. That's too simplistic and people work it out far too quickly. So this is a close-up showing the off-form concrete, which is not so easy to do in rural China because you don't get the experienced work people to do it. And in this case, they had to bring people from Kunming about 6 hours by train away to come and do it. You notice the thicknesses here? They are coping and hinting at precision, but in fact not capable of delivering it. And indoors, I call your attention to something I call kerning, which is 2 things taking up and kind of like a bridge house or something like that. 2 elements continuous with each other. So the side of the bathtub is coming up and becoming the back of the desk. The similarity of the openings here, the larger window opening behind this and the shrinking of this are playing tricks with you in the perception of size. So we have been developing, without telling you, a distinction between hi-fi vocabulary and lo-fi vocabulary. Hi-fi is high fidelity, lo-fi is low fidelity. And in rural China, we are mostly dealing with lo-fi architecture. And this distinction has been elaborated most recently by Jeremy Till, a professor in London. So far, our lo-fi vocabulary for thinking about boutique hotels is listed here for you. You're very welcome to take a photograph of the image instead of taking notes yourself. But you see that this list of vocabulary is not what you have normal for discussing hotel design or architectural design. And they are tailor-made to point to the specificity of the images that we have been looking for. It's not that we use theoretical terms to sound intelligent, but rather we use the unusual vocabulary to call attention to the unusual effects that we are seeing in those images. The architects usually are not thinking about these terms when they are designing these works, but when we raise it with them, they have the opportunity to look back and to see whether it does fit the outcomes and the intentions or not. And if they generally are vehemently opposed to it, I would just delete a particular line just to go along with them. Last part is about the Lost Villa. And this is a village where Chiang Kai-shek used to have a summer resort. So it's outside of Shanghai, 2 hours by drive. So in the village buildings, there are all sorts of ownership rights, and you really have to respond to them. For example, there is a vegetable patch here, and it's because the old lady who owned that plot didn't want to give up her business of growing vegetables. So you have to fit your hotel around what she wanted to do. There are other neighbors who have other ideas as well that you have to work with. And these requirements or expectations might not be announced to you when you do your designing. When you have started building the project, they started announcing their objections and so on. So you are developing and changing, and eventually, if you don't do it properly, it will look terrible. There's no survey drawings in villages, so where the electricity cables are is a guesswork thing. You might find the cables 1 meter closer to where you thought they were, and you have to move a wall or something like that. So eventually, we developed an idea that there were constraints, and there were ad hoc responses to the constraints, and this led to 4 kinds of considerations, which I listed for you in English on the lower right of this image. So the design thinking is very specific, and we're not narrating it as if it was a generic design process. Because we're interested that each site has its own contingencies, we started listing them by what the architect thought was predictable or unpredictable. Natural Build is a firm with 3 partners, and Shui Yanfei, the design partner, is trained in Tongji University and Princeton University. A young person who could read Dalibor Vesely, and actually was accompanying Dalibor Vesely to Suzhou about 10 years ago. So this is a guy who could actually read something and write something and do the jobs. So he's quite an unusual guy with a broad expertise. So we thought that different contingencies would devolve into different aspects of the design. This diagram is a post facto review of how to use different aspects of design to respond to whichever contingency. Eventually, there is a topological diagram narrating different aspects of the design, and there's a sectional relationship between them as well. The local government thought that there were not enough restaurants to cope with tourists, and so they were interested in a publicly accessible restaurant. And of course, you have to separate the traffic. So this is part of the result, and the lobby is this. And we're noticing how the openings are overscaled and underscaled. And from the outside, on the left-hand side, you wouldn't have imagined that the inside is that big. And this is the sort of effect that reminded us of the issues that we were discussing. There were structural things that couldn't be done very properly, and especially lines meeting at corner very precisely. And so those things were done actually with a different material, so you get that, and it's incorporating the air conditioning and so on. There was a giant tree there, and there were 9 window frames taking advantage of the tree. And there were these wooden panels. It's a patented window frame, steel and wood together. But the wooden part of the panel allows you to hide the ground surface outside at some angles and can bring the scene much closer to you. In this image, I call your attention to the reduction of the number of chairs and other furnishings. And there's an attempt to background some of the furniture so that the room appears bigger than it really is. The sizing of those paintings are also calibrated with the other openings to give a range of scale so that you don't just feel that there's one scale and it's small. Frank Lloyd Wright has an idea that furniture in rooms can be considered with architectural elements as an organic unity, pretty much as a background for human activity, as much as things that you can look at them for their own sake. And this seems to be relevant to here. David Leatherbarrow has an article called "What Fragments Are to Desire, Elements Are to Design." And here he's thinking that fragments stir your desire for things. So you frame things, you present things as fragments. So we started thinking about footprints of the existing buildings as a pretext of fragmentation and so on. If we had time, we would go into a distinction between redundant precision and apparent precision, which is very helpful for rural work when you couldn't have very, very absolute precision. Sergison, the Swiss architect, has also a recent article in a book called The Working Drawing, out of print now, where he called attention to the management of dimensional information in the drawings. So in practice, you have a road building company that was a mafia locally that monopolized all building works in that village. And the architect said we had to use them. When they built the wall, it was double curved surface. And then you have to hide the problem. These are two related views showing a different sense of distance, which is what we had seen in the gardens. So overall, we're not talking about intentions and concepts leading directly to results with a formal appearance. We have a pushing hands vocabulary, and it's listed there for you. The site-specific aspects of the study doesn't mean a reuse or abstraction of regional features or ornaments. It doesn't mean reuse of traditional building materials either. So it is a rather unusual idea that we are pushing in front of you, and I would welcome a discussion about that. Thank you very much.